Before we dive in, a quick but important note. This video is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical or mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have seen in this presentation. 1 in 5. Take a look around the next time you're in a coffee shop, at the grocery store, or even in a work meeting. 1 in 5 U.S. adults experiences mental illness each year. That's nearly 60 million people. That's more than the entire population of California and Texas combined. And for young people, the number is even more staggering. 1 in 6 youth aged 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. This isn't some distant, abstract problem. This is happening in our homes, our schools, and our workplaces. It's affecting our friends, our family, our colleagues, and maybe it's affecting you. The craziest part? For decades, this has been the great unspoken epidemic. A battle fought in silence behind closed doors, fueled by shame and misunderstanding. We can talk about a broken arm. We can talk about diabetes or high blood pressure. But for so long, talking about anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, or PTSD has been taboo. It's been seen as a weakness, a character flaw, or something to just get over. But you can't just get over a chemical imbalance in your brain, any more than you can get over a fractured bone by just thinking positive thoughts. That silence, that stigma, is a killer. It prevents people from seeking help. It isolates them when they need connection the most. It creates a world where people suffer needlessly, believing they are entirely alone in their struggle. But what if we could change that? What if we could turn the tide, break the silence, and replace stigma with support? What if we dedicated a specific time to drag this conversation out of the shadows and into the light? Well, that's exactly what Mental Health Awareness Month is all about. And that is precisely why this video exists. Over the next several minutes, we are going to pull back the curtain on this critical observance. This isn't going to be a superficial overview with a few platitudes and a green ribbon graphic. No, we're going deep. We are going to arm you with the knowledge, the context, and the understanding to see why the month of May is one of the most important months on the American calendar. Here's my promise to you. By the end of this presentation, you will not only understand the history of Mental Health Awareness Month, but you'll grasp its profound relevance in today's world. You'll understand the key themes, the hidden challenges, and most importantly, you'll walk away with a clearer picture of the role you can play. Whether you're looking for help, trying to support a loved one, or simply want to be a more informed and compassionate citizen, we're going to transform awareness into action. So how did this all begin? How did we go from locking people away in asylums to having a nationally recognized month of advocacy and support? The story is more fascinating, and more important, than you might think. It doesn't start in the 2000s with social media hashtags. It doesn't even start in the 80s or 90s. We have to go all the way back to 1949. The world was rebuilding after the horrors of World War II. Millions of soldiers were returning home, not just with physical wounds, but with deep, invisible scars we would later come to call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Society didn't have a name for it then. It was often dismissed as shell shock or battle fatigue. Soldiers were expected to be tough, to be stoic, and to simply reintegrate into civilian life without a fuss. But the human mind doesn't work that way. During this time, an organization called Mental Health America, which was then known as the National Association for Mental Health, decided to take a stand. This group was founded by a man named Clifford Whittingham Beers, a former patient of several mental asylums in the early 1900s. He had experienced the horrific, inhumane conditions of these institutions firsthand: abuse, neglect, and treatments that were more like torture than therapy. His best-selling book, A Mind That Found Itself, exposed these atrocities and sparked a reform movement. So, in 1949, Beers' organization launched the very first Mental Health Week. The goal was simple, yet revolutionary for its time: to educate the American public about mental illness and the importance of mental wellness. They wanted to show people that mental health conditions were real, treatable illnesses, not moral failings. They wanted to fight the stigma that kept people in chains, both literal and metaphorical. Think about the courage that took. In an era of conformity, of the picket fence ideal, they were talking about the messy, complicated, and uncomfortable realities of the human mind. They were challenging the very foundation of how society viewed mental illness. They were advocating for community-based care, for therapy, for compassion, at a time when the primary solution was still institutionalization. For decades, this week in May was a small but persistent drumbeat. Advocates used it to lobby for policy changes, to distribute pamphlets, to get stories in local newspapers, and to slowly, painstakingly chip away at the mountain of stigma. They pushed for the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, a landmark piece of legislation signed by President John F. Kennedy, which aimed to move patients from state institutions to community-based treatment centers. It was a monumental shift in philosophy, from isolating the mentally ill to integrating them into society. The movement grew. The science evolved. We developed better therapies, more effective medications, and a much deeper understanding of the brain. The conversation started to get a little louder. The week-long observance eventually expanded into a full month, officially becoming Mental Health Awareness Month. And as the years went on, the theme of the month began to reflect the changing needs of the country. In the beginning, the focus was largely on serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, conditions that were profoundly misunderstood and stigmatized. But over time, the conversation broadened. It began to include depression, anxiety disorders, which we now know are the most common mental health conditions in the United States. It started to address the mental health of children, of veterans, of new mothers struggling with postpartum depression. It started to recognize the intricate link between mental health and physical health, proving you cannot have one without the other. Every year, Mental Health America sets a new theme for the month, a focal point for the national conversation. In recent years, themes have included Tools to Thrive, focusing on practical skills to improve mental resilience, Back to Basics, providing foundational knowledge about mental health, and themes centered on the mind-body connection or the importance of early intervention. This isn't just about branding. These themes are a strategic response to what's happening in America. When the pandemic hit, the focus shifted to coping with isolation and grief. In the face of economic uncertainty, themes have addressed financial stress and its impact on mental well-being. The month acts as a mirror, reflecting our society's most pressing challenges and offering a framework for how to face them. It's a living, breathing campaign that adapts to the world we live in. And that brings us to today. We live in a world of hyperconnectivity, yet studies show we are lonelier than ever. We are bombarded with curated images of success and happiness on social media, leading to rampant comparison and anxiety. The pressures on our young people are immense. The political and social climate is divisive and stressful. The need for this conversation has never been more urgent. The silent epidemic is getting louder, and Mental Health Awareness Month is the megaphone we need to make sure everyone can hear it. It's our annual call to action, our national check-in. It's a reminder that your brain is a part of your body, and taking care of it isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. But to truly understand why this is a necessity, we have to pull back the curtain of time. We have to go back to an era when the mind was a mystery box, and if it was broken, the solution was often to lock it away and throw away the key. Imagine a world without therapy apps, without crisis hotlines, without the simple language to say, "I'm not okay." That was the reality. And it's in that oppressive silence that the story of Mental Health Awareness Month really begins. The year is 1949. World War II has ended, the suburbs are booming, and America is projecting an image of unstoppable optimism. But beneath that polished surface, millions were struggling in silence. And a group called Mental Health America, then known as the National Association for Mental Health, decided that silence was no longer an option. They designated May as the official month to fight in the open, to educate, to advocate, and to shatter the stigma that had been built up over centuries. But 1949 isn't even the real beginning. To find that, you have to go back another 4 decades to one man, a man who went through hell and decided to build a ladder out of the flames for everyone else. His name was Clifford Whittingham Beers. Clifford Beers was not a doctor, a psychologist, or a politician. He was a recent graduate of Yale University, a young man on the cusp of a promising career in finance. But in the wake of his brother's death from epilepsy, a condition he tragically and incorrectly believed he would also develop, his mind began to unravel. He was plunged into a deep depression, punctuated by terrifying episodes of paranoia and delusion. He attempted to take his own life, and for that he was sent away. For the next 3 years, Clifford Beers was a patient in some of America's most prestigious private and state-run mental institutions. But what he found inside wasn't care. It was a nightmare. He was bound in straitjackets for days on end, left in freezing, isolated cells. He was choked, beaten, and neglected by the very people entrusted with his healing. He witnessed unspeakable cruelty inflicted on other patients, people who were treated not as human beings in pain, but as animals to be tamed or problems to be hidden. In these places there was no therapy, there was no compassion, there was only control and confinement. The prevailing belief was that mental illness was a sign of moral failing, a permanent stain on one's character. The treatment was designed to break the will, not to heal the mind. But something incredible happened to Clifford Beers in the depths of that despair. His mind, the very thing that had betrayed him, became his greatest weapon. He began to meticulously observe and document everything he saw. He memorized conversations. He noted the details of the abuse. He began to formulate a plan. He realized that the system wasn't just broken. It was fundamentally inhumane, built on a foundation of fear and ignorance. And he knew with a burning certainty that the only way to tear it down was to expose it to the world. Upon his release, he did exactly that. In 1908, he published one of the most important books in the history of mental health advocacy, A Mind That Found Itself. It was a raw, unflinching, and explosive account of his time in the asylums. It was a bestseller. It shocked the conscience of a nation. For the first time, the public was given a first-hand look behind the locked doors and barred windows. They saw the system not through the eyes of a doctor, but through the eyes of a patient, a human being. The book was a sensation. It landed on the desks of people like William James, the father of American psychology, and Adolf Meyer, one of the most influential psychiatrists of his era. They rallied to his cause. With their support, Clifford Beers founded the Connecticut Society for Mental Hygiene in 1908, which soon grew into the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, the organization that would eventually become Mental Health America. This wasn't just about reforming asylums. It was about something much more revolutionary. Beers and his allies championed a new concept, mental hygiene. The idea was that mental health, like physical health, was something that could be protected and maintained. It wasn't just about treating severe illness. It was about preventing it. It was about creating conditions in our homes, schools, and communities that would allow our minds to flourish. It was a radical shift from a model of confinement to a model of public health. Think about that. In an era where mental illness was a source of deep personal shame, to be hidden at all costs, these pioneers were arguing that mental well-being was a public responsibility, that it was something to be cultivated, not just corrected. It was the first seed of the idea that taking care of your brain is a necessity, not a luxury. So when this same organization, decades later in 1949, launched the first Mental Health Month, they were building on the foundation that Clifford Beers had laid with his own suffering. They were continuing his fight. The world had changed. The horrors of the old asylums were slowly being addressed, but the underlying stigma remained. People were still afraid to talk. Families were still ashamed. The language of mental health was still whispered, if it was spoken at all. Mental Health Month was designed to be a loudspeaker. It was a dedicated time to force the conversation into the open. Early campaigns focused on educating the public about the signs of mental illness, promoting the idea that it was treatable, and advocating for more humane and effective care. They sent out pamphlets, they got stories in newspapers, they encouraged communities to hold events. It was a grassroots effort to change hearts and minds, one person at a time. And why May? There's no grand, symbolic reason buried in history. It was a practical choice. A time of year associated with renewal and new beginnings. Spring. A fitting metaphor for a movement aimed at letting the light into the darkest corners of human experience. It was a time to plant new ideas, that recovery is possible, that help is available, and that no one has to suffer alone. The world Clifford Beers exposed was one of chains and isolation. The world we live in today is vastly different, but the echoes of that past are still with us. The fear of judgment, the misunderstanding from friends or family, the feeling that you are somehow broken or less than, that is the modern legacy of the stigma that Beers fought against with every fiber of his being. The physical walls of the asylum may have come down, but the invisible walls of shame and silence can be just as imprisoning. That's why this story matters. It's not just a history lesson. It's a reminder of what's at stake. Mental Health Awareness Month isn't just a corporate wellness initiative or a trending hashtag. It is the direct descendant of a revolutionary human rights movement. It was born from one man's refusal to be broken by a brutal system, and his audacious belief that a better world was possible. It's a fight that began over a century ago, carried on by countless advocates, doctors, and everyday people who were brave enough to share their own stories. So how did one man's harrowing account and a small dedicated group of reformers ignite a movement that would span decades, survive world wars, and fundamentally change the very language we use to talk about our own minds? How did it evolve from a fight against straitjackets to a conversation about mindfulness, therapy, and systemic change? The answer, like so many great shifts in American history, begins not with a committee or a piece of legislation, but with a single furious voice. The voice of a man who had been to hell and back, and who returned with a story so harrowing it simply could not be ignored. His name was Clifford Whittingham Beers. In the early 1900s, Beers was a recent Yale graduate, a young man on the cusp of a promising life. But then his mind, as he would later describe it, turned against him. Following a severe bout of depression and paranoia, culminating in a suicide attempt, he was committed. For the next 3 years, Beers was shuttled between various private and state-run mental institutions. And what he experienced there was not care. It was a nightmare. He was bound in a straitjacket for days on end, so tightly that his circulation was cut off. He was choked, beaten, and left in isolation for weeks. He witnessed other patients suffering unimaginable cruelty, their cries for help met with indifference or further violence. In these asylums, the mentally ill were not seen as people in need of healing. They were seen as problems to be managed, animals to be caged. But unlike so many others who were broken by this system, something inside Clifford Beers refused to snap. A fire of indignation began to burn. He meticulously documented everything he saw, every injustice, every moment of degradation. He wasn't just a patient. He became a secret correspondent from the front lines of a hidden war. Upon his release in 1903, he channeled his rage and his trauma into a manuscript. In 1908, he published A Mind That Found Itself, an explosive first-hand account of the barbaric conditions inside America's asylums. The book was a sensation. It did for the institutionalized what The Jungle did for meatpackers. It ripped away the curtain of secrecy and forced a comfortable, progressive-era America to look at the horrors it was funding with its tax dollars. For the first time, the public was hearing not from a doctor or a reformer, but from a patient, an eloquent, educated man who could articulate the profound psychological terror of his experience. Beers's book became the founding document for a new movement, which he called mental hygiene. The name might sound a bit dated to us now, but the idea was revolutionary. The goal wasn't just to reform the asylums, it was to prevent people from ending up there in the first place. It was about promoting mental health as a public good, just like physical hygiene. It was about early intervention, education, and creating a society where mental distress could be addressed with compassion and science, not with locks and chains. In 1909, with the support of some of the nation's leading thinkers, he founded the National Committee for Mental Hygiene, the organization that would eventually become Mental Health America. The fight had a new name and a new leader. But even as Beers's movement was gaining steam, the world was about to change in a way that would thrust mental health into the national spotlight like never before. In 1914, the Great War erupted in Europe. By 1917, American soldiers were heading to the trenches. They were prepared for bullets, gas, and artillery. They were not prepared for the war's effect on their minds. Soldiers began returning from the front with a mysterious and terrifying condition. They had uncontrollable tremors, paralyzing anxiety, terrifying nightmares, and a complete inability to function. At first, doctors were baffled. They called it shell shock, believing it was caused by the physical concussion of exploding shells rattling the brain. But they soon realized that men who had never been near an explosion were suffering the same symptoms. The cause wasn't physical, it was psychological. The sheer, unrelenting horror of modern warfare, the constant fear, the gruesome sights, the loss of comrades, was shattering men's minds on an industrial scale. The military didn't know what to do. Initially, shell shock was treated as cowardice or malingering. Men were shamed, punished, sometimes even executed. But the problem was too widespread to ignore. Nearly 10% of all combat casualties were psychiatric. The US government was forced to acknowledge a difficult truth. The bravest, strongest men in the country could be broken not by a bullet, but by trauma. This was a monumental shift. It legitimized psychological suffering in a way that Clifford Beers's story, for all its power, could not. This wasn't happening to the insane locked away in asylums. It was happening to our boys, to America's heroes. While the battlefields of France created a crisis, the quiet consulting rooms of Vienna and Zurich were offering a new way to understand it. This was the dawn of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and their contemporaries were proposing a radical new map of the human mind. They argued that our conscious thoughts were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lay the unconscious, a vast, hidden world of desires, fears, and memories, often stemming from childhood, that drove our behavior in ways we didn't understand. Their proposed cure was just as radical: the talking cure. The idea that by talking to a trained professional, a patient could uncover these hidden conflicts, bring them into the light, and thereby alleviate their suffering. This was a profound departure from the asylum model. It suggested that mental illness wasn't just a biological defect or a moral failing. It was a story that had become tangled and that with help could be untangled. Psychoanalysis gave the world a new language to talk about the inner self. Terms like ego, repression, and trauma entered the vocabulary. It offered a path to healing that was based on understanding, not just confinement. The 1920s and 30s saw these two streams: the public health-focused mental hygiene movement and the individual-focused psychoanalytic movement begin to merge. The country was grappling with massive social change. The Roaring Twenties gave way to the crushing despair of the Great Depression. The link between social conditions and mental well-being became painfully obvious. Widespread unemployment, poverty, and uncertainty led to spikes in what were then called nervous breakdowns. The mind was not separate from the world, it was deeply affected by it. Then came the Second World War. The scale was even greater, the stakes even higher. But this time, the military had learned a lesson from the shell shock epidemic. For the first time, they began using psychological screening tests on recruits, trying to weed out those deemed mentally unfit for combat. The effort was crude and often discriminatory, but it represented a huge conceptual leap: the acknowledgement that mental fitness was as critical as physical fitness for a soldier. During the war, a new group of witnesses emerged. Conscientious objectors, who refused to fight for religious or moral reasons, were often assigned to work in state mental hospitals to fulfill their service. What these thousands of young, idealistic men saw there horrified them. They found the same conditions Clifford Beers had written about decades earlier: filth, neglect, and shocking brutality. They smuggled out cameras, took photos, and wrote blistering reports. When Life magazine published a photographic exposé in 1946 titled Bedlam, based on their accounts, the nation was once again shamed into action. The images of emaciated patients living in squalor were impossible to defend. This exposé, combined with the immense challenge of caring for hundreds of thousands of psychologically wounded veterans returning from the war, created a perfect storm. The problem was too big for charities and state governments to handle alone. The federal government had to step in. And so in 1946, Congress passed a landmark piece of legislation: the National Mental Health Act. It was a watershed moment. It was the first piece of federal legislation to prioritize mental health for the entire nation. It did three crucial things. First, it established the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIM, dedicating a federal agency to the scientific study of the mind and mental illness. Second, it provided funding to states to establish new clinics and improve community-based mental health services. And third, it allocated money to train a new generation of psychiatrists, psychologists, and psychiatric nurses. With this single act, the U.S. government formally declared that mental health was an essential component of public health. It was a victory born from the pain of Clifford Beers, the trauma of 2 world wars, the insights of psychoanalysis, and the courage of whistleblowers. The fight had moved from the asylum gates to the halls of Congress. A new era of scientific research and federal responsibility had begun. But even as this new foundation was being laid, radical and terrifying new treatments were emerging from the laboratory and the operating room. The conversation was about to shift from talking cures to shock therapy, from asylums to lobotomies, and to the dawn of a new pharmaceutical age that would change everything once again. The search for a cure was no longer confined to the quiet, wood-paneled offices of psychoanalysts. It had moved into the sterile, unforgiving light of the hospital ward. The prevailing theory was shifting. If mental illness wasn't just a product of a troubled mind, but a disease of the brain itself, a biological defect, a kind of faulty wiring, then surely it could be physically corrected. The brain was an organ, after all. And if you couldn't talk it into behaving, perhaps you could shock it, cut it, or drug it into submission. This was the age of heroic and often horrific intervention. The first wave of these physical treatments came in the 1930s, and they were centered on a terrifyingly simple idea: inducing a massive systemic shock to the body to reboot the brain. In Vienna, a physician named Manfred Sockel began experimenting with insulin coma therapy. He would inject schizophrenic patients with large doses of insulin, plunging their bodies into hypoglycemic shock, and eventually, a deep coma. After an hour or so, they would be revived with a glucose solution. The process was incredibly dangerous with a significant risk of death. But for some, the results seemed miraculous. Patients who had been catatonic for years would wake up lucid, able to speak and recognize their families. The shock, it seemed, had somehow reset their minds. The news spread like wildfire through the psychiatric community. Here, at last, was a tangible biological treatment. Hot on its heels came letrozole convulsive therapy. A Hungarian neuropsychiatrist, Ladislas Meduna, observed incorrectly, as it turned out, that epilepsy and schizophrenia rarely occurred in the same person. He theorized that a seizure might therefore have a curative effect on psychosis. He began injecting patients with a stimulant called letrozole, which induced violent, full-body convulsions. The treatment was brutal. Patients would often thrash so hard they fractured their vertebrae or shattered their teeth. They were terrified of the procedure, often begging not to undergo it again. But again, for a subset of patients, particularly those with severe depression, the effects could be dramatic. The suffocating weight of their illness would lift, at least for a while. These therapies, as crude as they were, paved the way for something that still exists today, albeit in a radically different form: electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Two Italian physicians, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, saw the promise of seizure therapy, but sought a more controlled, less terrifying method than letrozole. They developed a machine that could pass a carefully calibrated electric current through the brain, inducing a clean, predictable seizure. First tested in Rome in 1938, ECT was seen as a major advancement. It was faster, safer than the chemical methods, and remarkably effective for severe, treatment-resistant depression and catatonia. It quickly became the gold standard of somatic treatments, a powerful new tool in the asylum's arsenal. But an even more direct, more permanent, and more terrifying tool was just on the horizon. The idea was audacious, born from a chillingly simple premise. If a person's debilitating anxiety, their endless loops of obsessive thought, were caused by faulty circuits in the frontal lobes of the brain, what if you could just sever them? In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Muniz developed a procedure he called a leucotomy. He would drill holes into the sides of a patient's skull and insert a thin instrument called a leucotome, sweeping it back and forth to destroy the nerve fibers connecting the frontal lobes to the rest of the brain. The goal was to cut the connection between thought and emotion, to surgically remove a person's anguish. The results were immediate and profound. Agitated, violent patients became placid. Anxious, obsessive patients became calm. For this discovery, Egas Muniz would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949. The world hailed it as a landmark achievement. But it was an American neurologist, Walter Freeman, who would take Muniz's procedure and turn it into a terrifyingly efficient, assembly line operation. Freeman was a showman, a crusader. He believed he had found the key to solving the mental illness crisis that was overwhelming America's asylums. He modified Muniz's technique, renaming it the lobotomy, and pioneered a new, faster method that didn't even require drilling through the skull. It was called the transorbital lobotomy. The procedure was shockingly simple. Freeman would have the patient rendered unconscious with electroshock. Then he would take a long, thin instrument, essentially a reinforced ice pick, insert it above the patient's eyeball through the thin bone of the eye socket, and tap it into the brain with a mallet. He'd then sweep the instrument back and forth, severing the frontal lobe connections. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Freeman became a missionary for his new cure. He bought a van, which he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, and toured the country, performing thousands of lobotomies in state hospitals, sometimes dozens in a single day for an audience of doctors and nurses. He saw himself as a liberator, emptying the back wards of hopeless cases. But the cost was immense. While the lobotomy did calm patients, it did so by destroying the very essence of their personality. The spark of who they were was extinguished. Patients were often left apathetic, emotionally blunted, and childlike. They lost their initiative, their judgment, their ability to plan or feel deep emotion. They were easier to manage, but they were shells of their former selves. Perhaps the most famous victim of this procedure was Rosemary Kennedy, the sister of President John F. Kennedy. Prone to mood swings and emotional outbursts that embarrassed her politically ambitious family, her father, Joseph Kennedy, arranged for her to have a lobotomy performed by Walter Freeman in 1941. She was 23 years old. The procedure was a catastrophe. It left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to walk or speak coherently. She was hidden away in an institution for the rest of her life, her existence all but erased from the family's public story. Rosemary's tragedy was just one of an estimated 50,000 lobotomies performed in the United States, a dark chapter driven by desperation and a terrifying confidence in the surgeon's knife. The era of shock and surgery, however, was about to be eclipsed by an even more profound revolution. This one wouldn't come from a scalpel or an electrode, but from a small, unassuming pill. In the early 1950s, French scientists searching for a better anesthetic stumbled upon a compound called chlorpromazine. They noticed it had a powerful calming effect, reducing anxiety without causing heavy sedation. When it was tested on psychotic patients at a Paris hospital, the results were stunning. Patients who had been tormented by hallucinations and delusions, who were agitated and living in a world of their own, became calm, rational, and coherent. Their core symptoms seemed to simply melt away. Marketed in the United States under the brand name Thorazine, it became the world's first true antipsychotic drug. It was hailed as a miracle, a chemical lobotomy, that could achieve what the ice pick promised but without destroying the brain. For the first time, the most severe symptoms of illnesses like schizophrenia could be managed effectively. It wasn't a cure, but it was a key that could finally unlock the doors of the massive, overcrowded asylums that had defined mental health care for over a century. The promise was intoxicating. With these new wonder drugs, hundreds of thousands of patients could be discharged. They could leave the institutions behind and re-enter society, living normal lives in their own communities. The great emptying of the asylums was about to begin. But no one, not the doctors, not the politicians, not the families, was truly prepared for what would happen when those doors swung open. The year is 1963. A young, charismatic president, John F. Kennedy, stands before Congress. He is there to deliver a special message, the first of its kind by a U.S. president, dedicated entirely to mental health and mental retardation. His own sister, Rosemary, had been lobotomized, a family tragedy that deeply informed his perspective. Kennedy spoke not of warehousing people, but of treating them. He painted a picture of a new kind of care, one rooted not in the cold stone of a distant institution, but in the familiar soil of a person's own neighborhood. He declared, "We must seek out the causes of mental illness and mental retardation and eradicate them. We must strengthen the underlying resources of knowledge, and above all of skilled manpower which are necessary to mount a new and intensive attack on mental disability." His vision was revolutionary. It was a vision of community mental health centers, small local hubs where anyone could walk in and receive a spectrum of care, from outpatient therapy and emergency services to preventative education. The idea was to replace the massive isolated asylum with a network of accessible humane support systems. It was a promise to catch people before they fell, or to help them back up right where they stood instead of shipping them off to a place from which they might never return. This vision was codified into law. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was signed by President Kennedy just weeks before his assassination. It was one of the last major pieces of legislation he championed. The act authorized federal funding for the construction of over 2,000 community mental health centers across the nation. The plan was meticulous. For every 50,000 Americans, there would be a center. These centers would be the safety net, the crucial infrastructure that would make deinstitutionalization not just possible but successful. The doors of the asylums began to creak open. Between the mid-1950s and the mid-1990s, the number of patients in state mental hospitals would plummet from over 500,000 to fewer than 70,000. It was a mass exodus, a tide of humanity flowing out of the institutions and back into the world. On paper, it was a triumph of civil rights and modern medicine. It was the dawn of a new enlightened era. But a promise is only as strong as the will to keep it. And the will to fund this grand vision began to evaporate almost as soon as the ink was dry. Kennedy's death was a devastating blow, removing the movement's most powerful advocate. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, launched his Great Society programs and the War on Poverty, but soon his administration and the nation's treasury became consumed by a different, far more costly war in Vietnam. The national focus shifted from building clinics in Cleveland to fighting battles in Khe Sanh. The money that was supposed to build this nationwide mental health infrastructure was diverted. It was a classic case of political triage. Then came a crucial shift in policy. The federal government had promised to help build the centers, but the long-term funding to actually run them, to pay the salaries of doctors, nurses, and therapists, was meant to come from the states and local communities. But the states, having just saved a fortune by closing their massive, expensive asylums, were often reluctant to spend that money on new, unproven community programs. They saw deinstitutionalization not as a transfer of responsibility, but as a way to wash their hands of a costly problem. The result was a ghost fleet of good intentions. Of the 2,000 centers that were planned, only about half were ever built. And many of those that did open their doors were hollowed-out versions of Kennedy's dream. They were underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed. They were equipped to handle what was often called the worried well, people with anxiety, mild depression, or life adjustment issues. They were not, however, prepared for the wave of patients being discharged from state hospitals, individuals with severe, chronic, and complex conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major psychosis, who required intensive, lifelong support. Imagine being one of those patients. You've spent 10, 20, maybe 30 years inside an institution. It's the only world you know. Your family ties may be frayed or completely severed. You have no job, no money, no place to live. One day, a doctor hands you a bottle of Thorazine and a bus ticket. You're told you're cured, or at least, managed. You are pushed out the door, into a world that has moved on without you. You're told to check in with a local community mental health center. But when you get there, you find a clinic with a 6-month waiting list, or a therapist who only works 9 to 5, or a program that simply isn't designed to help someone with your level of need. So what happens to you? Where do you go? For hundreds of thousands of people, the answer was nowhere. The safety net that was promised was never fully woven. They fell right through the gaps. Families who were told their loved ones were coming home were given no training, no financial support, and no respite care. They were left to cope with challenging behaviors and complex medical needs on their own, an impossible burden that shattered households and broke spirits. Many of the newly liberated patients ended up in what were called boarding homes or single-room occupancy hotels, flop houses that became grim, unregulated mini-asylums, rife with exploitation and abuse. Others, unable to cope, simply stopped taking their medication. Their symptoms returned and they drifted. They began to appear on the streets of America's cities, confused, disheveled, and alone. The era of mass deinstitutionalization became, for all intents and purposes, the era of mass homelessness. The sight of a person muttering to themselves on a street corner, a common and tragic feature of modern urban life, is a direct legacy of this catastrophic policy failure. It wasn't just a failure of funding. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of severe mental illness. The new medications were effective for many, but they weren't a cure. They managed symptoms, but they didn't teach life skills, provide housing, or create a supportive community. The architects of deinstitutionalization had successfully dismantled the old system, but they had failed utterly to build its replacement. They had opened the cage door but had forgotten to build a sanctuary on the other side. They had pushed people out of the back wards and unintentionally onto the sidewalks. The great emptying of the asylums was not the compassionate liberation it was meant to be. It became a slow-motion disaster, an abandonment of America's most vulnerable citizens on a scale never seen before. The dream of community care, born from the highest ideals of a slain president, had collapsed into a nightmare on the streets. And in its place, two new, brutal institutions would rise to take the asylum's place: the homeless shelter and the prison cell. How did the justice system become America's de facto mental health system? That's where our story goes next. The promise was a beautiful one, a sunlit vision of community, of care, of dignity. But that promise was built on a foundation of sand. The money that was supposed to follow the patients out of the asylum doors, it never fully arrived. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963 was a landmark piece of legislation, but it was just a blueprint. It authorized the creation of these community centers, but the actual consistent, long-term funding was left to future politicians. And as the decades wore on, priorities shifted. Economic downturns, changing political winds, and a general sense of out of sight, out of mind began to starve the very system that was meant to be a revolution in care. Then came the 1980s. Under the Reagan administration, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 effectively repealed the Community Mental Health Act. Federal funding was consolidated into block grants given to the states, which came with massive cuts and gave states the freedom to spend the money on other priorities. And they did. The lifeline was severed. The community mental health centers that did exist were underfunded, understaffed, and completely overwhelmed. They were designed to help people with mild to moderate conditions, not the thousands of patients with severe, persistent illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, who were now walking out of state hospitals with little more than a bus ticket and a bottle of medication. So a vacuum was created. A vast, gaping hole in America's social safety net. And into this vacuum fell hundreds of thousands of the most vulnerable people in our society. They had no family to turn to, no case manager to guide them, no supportive housing to shelter them. They ended up on the streets. And on the streets, the symptoms of their illnesses, the paranoia that makes you shout at unseen threats, the mania that leads to erratic behavior, the disorientation that makes you trespass just to find a place to sleep, these symptoms were no longer seen as medical issues. They were seen as crimes. Suddenly, loitering, public disturbance, and petty theft weren't calls for a social worker. They were calls for a police officer. When someone was in the throes of a psychotic break, screaming in a public park, there was no mobile crisis unit to call. There was only 911, and the police, trained to handle threats and enforce laws, arrived on the scene. They weren't equipped with the tools of de-escalation for a psychiatric crisis. They were equipped with handcuffs and a service weapon. An arrest was often the only tool they had to resolve the situation. This process has a name: trans-institutionalization. It means moving a population from one institution to another. We didn't end institutionalization in America. We just changed the address. We moved it from the state hospital to the county jail. Think about it from the perspective of a judge in the 1980s or 90s. A man with untreated schizophrenia is brought before you for the 5th time for shoplifting food. You can see he's sick. He needs help. But the waitlist for the local mental health clinic is 6 months long. The homeless shelters are full and dangerous. But the county jail, the jail has a bed. It has a roof. It provides 3 meals a day. In a broken system, sending a sick person to prison can start to look like the most compassionate option. It becomes a perverse form of social work, a way to get a desperate person off the street, even if it's into a cage. The jail becomes the path of least resistance. The result is a statistic that should shock every single one of us to our core. Today, there are more than 10 times as many people with serious mental illness in our nation's prisons and jails than in our state-run psychiatric hospitals. Let me repeat that. 10 times more. Jails have become, by default, America's new asylums. And we're not talking about small numbers. The 3 largest mental health care providers in the entire United States are not hospitals. They are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York City. On any given day, these 3 facilities house more mentally ill individuals than all of the country's psychiatric hospitals combined. We have criminalized mental illness on an industrial scale. And what is life like for someone with a severe mental illness inside one of these concrete warehouses? It is a living hell. A jail is a sensory nightmare. It's loud, it's chaotic, it's violent. It is the single worst environment imaginable for someone whose mind is already fragile. The rigid, punitive structure of a correctional facility is the antithesis of a therapeutic environment. Inmates with mental illness are often unable to follow the complex rules, leading to punishments that only worsen their condition. The most common tool used to manage them? Solitary confinement. They are locked away in a tiny cell for 23 hours a day. We know from decades of research that sensory deprivation and social isolation can induce psychosis in a healthy person. For someone already struggling with a disorder like schizophrenia, it is state-sanctioned torture. It deepens their psychosis, intensifies their paranoia, and pushes them further away from any hope of recovery. They are being punished for their symptoms. And pouring gasoline on this raging fire was the war on drugs. The tough-on-crime policies that began in the 80s and accelerated in the 90s created a dragnet that ensnared countless people with co-occurring disorders. That is, people struggling with both a mental illness and a substance use problem. Many people with untreated mental illness turn to drugs or alcohol to self-medicate, to quiet the voices or numb the pain. When police began sweeping the streets, they didn't see a person in need of dual diagnosis treatment. They saw a drug offender. Mandatory minimum sentencing and 3 strikes laws locked them away for years, sometimes decades, trapping them in a cycle of incarceration, release without treatment, and rearrest. This is the great tragic irony of the last 50 years of mental health policy. The movement to close the asylums began as a noble, progressive crusade for human rights, championed by civil libertarians on the left and fiscal conservatives on the right. They wanted to free people from the horrors of the snake pit. But in our haste to tear down the old walls, we failed to build a new foundation. We took the sickest, most vulnerable people in our society, people who needed more care, not less, and we abandoned them. We closed the back wards of the state hospitals only to open the cell blocks of the state prisons. We didn't solve the problem. We just made it less visible. We outsourced the care of our mentally ill to law enforcement officers, to corrections guards, and to a criminal justice system that was never designed and is fundamentally incapable of providing it. We traded one human rights crisis for another far larger one. But what happens on the street level, in that moment-to-moment interaction when a police officer, with a split second to make a decision, is confronted by a person in the midst of a terrifying mental health crisis? The answer to that question reveals the true human cost of this catastrophic failure. On October 26, 2020, a family in Philadelphia made a phone call. It was a call for help. Their 27-year-old son, Walter Wallace Jr., was having a severe mental health crisis. He was a husband, a father of 9, and an aspiring rapper who lived with bipolar disorder. His family knew the signs. They knew he needed medical assistance, so they called for an ambulance. But it wasn't an ambulance that arrived first. 2 police officers responded to the call. They found Walter Wallace Jr. outside, holding a knife. His mother pleaded with the officers, shouting that her son was mentally ill, begging them not to shoot. The officers, with their guns drawn, backed away, ordering him to drop the knife. He walked, not ran, towards them. In the span of a few seconds, they fired at least a dozen shots. Walter Wallace Jr. died in front of his mother, on the street where he grew up. His family had called for a medic. They got a firing squad instead. This is the human cost. This is what happens when a system designed to enforce laws is tasked with mending broken minds. The officers in that situation were not mental health professionals. They were trained to see a man with a knife as a threat to be neutralized, not a patient in the throes of a debilitating crisis. They had less lethal options like tasers, but they didn't use them. Why? Because their training, their instinct, their entire professional framework is built around threat assessment and the use of force, not de-escalation and compassionate care. And Walter Wallace Jr.'s story is not an anomaly. It's a symptom of a nationwide epidemic. Study after study confirms a horrifying truth. Individuals with untreated serious mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed during a police encounter than other civilians. At least 1 in 4 fatal police shootings involves a person with a mental illness. Think about that. 1 in 4. Police officers have become the de facto frontline responders to mental health emergencies in America. And it's a role they were never meant to fill. A burden they were never meant to carry. We have, in effect, criminalized mental illness. When a person with diabetes has a blood sugar crisis, we send paramedics. When a person with schizophrenia has a psychotic break, we send armed officers. And we act surprised when the outcome is tragic. The problem is baked into the very structure of our emergency response system. When you dial 911, your call is routed based on a simple, outdated logic: fire, crime, or medical emergency. A mental health crisis doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes, so it's most often classified as a police matter. This single decision, made by a dispatcher in a call center, sets in motion a chain of events that too often ends in violence, arrest, and incarceration, rather than treatment and recovery. An arrest record becomes a lifelong barrier to housing, employment, and stability, trapping individuals in a vicious cycle of crisis and punishment. The jail cell becomes the new asylum. But what if there was a different way? What if, when that family in Philadelphia called for help, a different kind of first responder showed up? Someone trained not in firearms, but in therapeutic communication. Someone equipped not with a baton, but with empathy and an understanding of psychopathology. This isn't a utopian fantasy. This is a model that already exists, and it's saving lives, saving money, and fundamentally changing how communities respond to crisis. It's called the Crisis Intervention Team Model, or CIT. Born out of a similar tragedy in Memphis, Tennessee in 1987, the CIT model provides law enforcement officers with intensive specialized training, typically a 40-hour course, on how to recognize and respond to mental health crises. They learn de-escalation techniques, verbal and nonverbal skills to calm a person in distress. They learn about different types of mental illness, the effects of psychotropic medications, and the local resources available for treatment. The goal is to transform a potentially violent confrontation into a safe referral to care. And the results are staggering. Studies show that CIT-trained officers are significantly less likely to use force, and their encounters are far more likely to result in the person being transported to a hospital for treatment rather than to a jail. But some cities are taking it a step further. They're asking a revolutionary question. What if the police didn't have to respond at all? In Eugene, Oregon, a program called Cahoots, Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets, has been answering that question for over 30 years. When a 911 call comes in that involves a mental health, substance abuse, or homelessness issue without a threat of violence, the dispatcher doesn't send the police. They send a Cahoots team, a medic paired with a crisis worker. These teams, operating out of a van, respond to thousands of calls a year. They provide on-site counseling, basic medical care, and transportation to shelters or clinics. They are unarmed. They wear civilian clothes, and their presence changes everything. In 2019, the Cahoots program responded to an estimated 24,000 calls, which accounted for roughly 20% of the total 911 call volume. Of those thousands of interactions, they called for police backup only 150 times. That's less than 1% of the time. This program saves the city of Eugene an estimated $8.5 million in public safety costs annually. But more importantly, it saves lives. It prevents the escalation that so often occurs when a badge and a gun are introduced into a fragile situation. Provides people with the care they actually need at the moment they need it most. Cities across the country, from Denver with its STAR program to Rochester, New York's Person in Crisis team, are now replicating this model. They are proving day in and day out that a public health problem requires a public health solution. They are demonstrating that we can build a system of care that is more compassionate, more effective, and more fiscally responsible than the failed system of criminalization we've relied on for decades. These programs are not anti-police. They are pro-community, pro-health, and pro-common sense. They allow police officers to focus on what they were actually trained to do, respond to and investigate crime, while allowing mental health professionals to do what they were trained to do. But these programs are still the exception, not the rule. For every one city with a robust mobile crisis team, there are 100 that still rely solely on police to handle every call that comes in after 5 p.m. The primary barriers are what you'd expect: funding, politics, and the sheer inertia of a system that resists change. It takes political will to divert resources from traditional policing to these new models. It takes a cultural shift to convince the public, and even some in law enforcement, that sending a social worker instead of a cop to a crisis call is not being soft, but being smart. It is the tactical, strategic, and humane thing to do. We have the blueprint. We have the proof of concept. The success of programs like Cahoots is not a mystery. It is a roadmap, a clear and undeniable path away from the tragedies of Walter Wallace Jr. and countless others. It shows us that we don't have to accept a world where a call for help is answered with a hail of bullets. The models for a better, safer, more humane system of crisis response are already here. The challenge is no longer one of invention, but of implementation. And as we'll see, that challenge extends far beyond the streets and into the very halls of justice themselves, where the collision between mental illness and the legal system creates a whole new realm of crisis. The largest mental health facilities in the United States are not hospitals. They're not clinics or specialized treatment centers. They are the Los Angeles County Jail, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and New York's Rikers Island. This isn't an exaggeration or a metaphor. It is a statistical fact. In America today, you are 10 times more likely to find a person with a serious mental illness in a prison or jail than in a state-run psychiatric hospital. This is the stark, brutal reality of that collision. Our justice system has become, by default, our nation's mental health care system. And it is a system designed for punishment, not for healing. So how did we get here? How did we allow our correctional facilities to become warehouses for our most vulnerable citizens? The story begins where the last one left off, with the promise of deinstitutionalization. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity: close the large, often inhumane state hospitals, and replace them with a network of community-based care centers. But the first part of that plan happened with far more efficiency than the second. The hospitals closed, their doors shuttered, and their funding slashed. But the robust community support system that was supposed to take their place? It never fully materialized. A patchwork of underfunded clinics and services appeared, but they were no match for the scale of the need. This created a massive vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped law enforcement. When a person is experiencing a psychotic break on a public street, when their paranoia causes them to act erratically, when their depression and desperation lead them to self-medicate with illegal substances, who gets called? Not a social worker, not a psychiatrist. The police get called. And police officers, who are trained primarily to enforce laws and respond to threats, are suddenly thrust into the role of frontline mental health workers, a job for which they are often ill-equipped and insufficiently trained. The result is tragically predictable. Behaviors that are the symptoms of an illness, disorderly conduct, trespassing, public disturbance, are treated as crimes. An arrest is made, and so begins a devastating cycle, a revolving door that spins people from the streets to the jail and back to the streets again, each rotation leaving them more broken than the last. Imagine this for a moment. You're arrested during a moment of profound crisis. You're disoriented, terrified, perhaps hearing voices or seeing things that aren't there. You are then placed into a county jail. The environment is a sensory assault. The clang of steel doors, the constant shouting, the fluorescent lights that never turn off, the ever-present threat of violence from other inmates. It's an environment that would be stressful for a perfectly healthy person. For someone with a pre-existing condition like PTSD, schizophrenia, or severe anxiety, it is a living nightmare. It is a catalyst for decompensation. Solitary confinement, a practice often used to manage inmates who are disruptive, a common outcome for someone whose illness is untreated, is a form of psychological torture that has been shown to induce psychosis, even in healthy individuals. Yet, we subject people who are already ill to it as a matter of routine. The so-called treatment they receive inside is often minimal at best. A brief consultation, a prescription for medication that may or may not be correct, administered inconsistently by overworked staff. This isn't care. It's crisis management in a cage. Then comes the release. After weeks, months, or even years, the person is let out, often in the middle of the night, with little more than the clothes on their back and a bus ticket. They have no housing, no job, no support network. They now have a criminal record, a massive barrier to employment and housing. They likely have no medication, no appointment with a psychiatrist, no plan for follow-up care. They are released back into the exact same circumstances that led to their arrest. Only now they are more traumatized, more isolated, and more stigmatized than ever before. Is it any wonder that within a few years, a staggering 75% of incarcerated individuals with mental illness will be arrested again? The system isn't just failing to solve the problem. It is actively perpetuating it. This isn't just an abstract policy issue. It's the story of millions of Americans. It's the story of a veteran, let's call him Marcus, who comes home from combat with the invisible wounds of PTSD. He struggles to reacclimate. The fireworks on the 4th of July sound like gunfire. Crowds trigger his hypervigilance. He turns to alcohol to quiet the noise in his head. The support systems promised by the VA are overwhelmed, with months-long waiting lists for therapy. One night, in a flashback, he gets into a public altercation. The police are called. They see a drunk and disorderly man, not a soldier battling demons. He's arrested for assault. In jail, the constant noise and lack of control send his PTSD into overdrive. He gets into fights. He's put in solitary. His condition deteriorates rapidly. He's eventually released on probation, with a felony record. He can't get his old job back. Landlords won't rent to him. His family, exhausted and scared, distances themselves. Alone and with no options, he ends up homeless, sleeping in a park, where he's eventually arrested again for trespassing. This is the revolving door. And Marcus is just one of millions trapped inside. The legal process itself creates another layer of absurdity. Before someone can even be tried for a crime, they must be deemed competent to stand trial. This means they have to be able to understand the charges against them and assist in their own defense. For many with serious mental illness, this is impossible without treatment. So they are ordered to a state hospital to be restored to competency. But because those hospitals are full with massive waitlists, they end up waiting for that spot. In jail, people can languish in a cell for months, sometimes even longer than the maximum sentence for their alleged crime, simply waiting for a bed to open up so they can get well enough to go to court. They are punished before they are ever proven guilty of anything. And what about the insanity defense? Thanks to television and movies, many believe it's a common get-out-of-jail-free card. The reality is profoundly different. The legal standard for insanity is incredibly high and difficult to meet. It's used in less than 1% of all felony cases, and it's successful in only a fraction of those. It is not a loophole. It is a rare and specific legal finding reserved for the most extreme cases of mental incapacitation. For decades, this grim cycle seemed unbreakable. But in the late 1990s, a new idea began to take root, a radical departure from the status quo: mental health courts. These specialized courts operate on a simple but revolutionary premise. What if we treated the illness instead of just punishing the symptom? They represent a collaborative, problem-solving approach, rather than an adversarial one. The judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and mental health professionals all work together as a team. Instead of a traditional sentence, a defendant who is eligible, typically someone with a diagnosed mental illness who has committed a nonviolent offense, can voluntarily enter the program. They agree to a court-monitored treatment plan, which could include therapy, medication management, housing support, and substance abuse counseling. The goal isn't punitive. The goal is recovery and stability. The judge acts less like an arbiter of guilt and more like a coach, holding regular check-ins, offering encouragement for progress, and imposing sanctions for non-compliance. If the person successfully completes the program, their charges are often reduced or dismissed entirely. The results have been remarkable. Studies across the country show that graduates of mental health courts are significantly less likely to be rearrested than their counterparts in the traditional system. They save taxpayer money because treatment is far less expensive than incarceration. But most importantly, they save lives. They offer a path out of the revolving door. They restore dignity and offer a chance for people to become stable, productive members of their communities again. These courts represent a profound shift in thinking, from punishment to healing. But they are still just small islands of hope in a vast ocean of crisis. The real question is, how do we turn these islands into a continent? How do we build a system of care so robust that the courtroom is no longer the first door, but the absolute last resort? The answer isn't a single silver bullet solution. It's a blueprint for a societal renovation, a complete reimagining of how we view and treat the health of the human mind. Building this continent of care requires us to work on multiple fronts simultaneously, laying a new foundation of policy, erecting a framework of integrated care, and then weaving a new social fabric of community and cultural understanding. It starts at the highest level, policy and funding. For decades, we've treated mental health as the underfunded, forgotten stepchild of healthcare. The Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008 was supposed to change that. It mandated that insurance coverage for mental health and substance use disorders be no more restrictive than coverage for physical health. A broken leg should be treated the same as a broken mind. It was a landmark promise. But a promise is only as good as its enforcement. Insurers have found countless loopholes. Smaller networks of mental health providers, more frequent requirements for prior authorization, and lower reimbursement rates that drive clinicians away from accepting insurance altogether. Building our continent means closing these loopholes with ironclad enforcement. It means treating mental health care not as a luxury, but as a fundamental human right, as essential as cardiology or oncology. It means a massive, sustained investment, a Marshall Plan for mental health, that funds not just crisis response, but the entire spectrum of care. We need to fund preventative programs in schools, early intervention services for young adults, and accessible outpatient clinics in every community. We don't wait for a city to flood before building levees. We shouldn't wait for a person to be in crisis before offering them help. With that foundation laid, we must build the framework, a truly integrated system of care. Right now, your brain and your body are treated by two entirely separate, often non-communicating systems. You go to a primary care doctor for a physical, but if you mention anxiety, you're often handed a pamphlet and a phone number, sent off on a lonely quest to find a specialist who might have a 6-month waiting list. This separation is an artificial barrier that costs lives. Integration means tearing down that wall. Imagine going for your annual checkup, and alongside checking your blood pressure and cholesterol, your doctor conducts a standardized mental health screening. Not just a casual "how are you feeling?" but a real evidence-based conversation. If you need support, they don't just give you a number. They walk you down the hall to a behavioral health specialist who is part of the same practice. This collaborative care model is not a futuristic dream. It's a proven model that leads to better outcomes, lower costs, and dramatically reduced stigma. It reframes mental health as just health. This integration must extend into our schools. We need school-based health centers that are staffed with therapists and counselors, making access to care as simple as visiting the school nurse. For a teenager struggling with depression, the hurdle of convincing their parents, getting a referral, and finding transportation can be insurmountable. Placing care directly in their path removes those barriers. It's about meeting people where they are, instead of forcing them to navigate a labyrinth to get the help they need. But even with the best policies and a perfectly integrated system, we face a monumental bottleneck, a severe shortage of people to provide the care. We simply do not have enough psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and counselors to meet the overwhelming demand, especially in rural America and low-income communities. Building our continent requires us to build a new workforce. This means radically expanding telehealth services, allowing a specialist in New York City to treat a patient in rural Wyoming. It means offering significant loan forgiveness and tuition incentives for students who commit to working in underserved areas, turning brain drain into brain gain. And it means expanding our very definition of a care provider. We need to empower and deploy an army of certified peer support specialists, individuals with lived experience of mental illness or addiction who are trained to guide and support others on their own recovery journeys. A peer specialist can offer something a clinician can't: the profound, life-altering message of, "I have been where you are. I know this darkness, and I can tell you with certainty that there is a way through it." They are living proof that recovery is possible, and they are one of the most underutilized resources in our entire system. While policy and infrastructure are being built, technology can act as a powerful accelerant. For generations, therapy was confined to a 50-minute session in a quiet office. Today, technology is democratizing access. Mental health apps can provide daily mood tracking, guided meditations, and cognitive behavioral therapy exercises. Crisis text lines offer immediate, 24/7 support to someone in their darkest moment. Teletherapy platforms have become a lifeline for millions, erasing barriers of distance and stigma. This isn't about replacing human connection. It's about augmenting it, providing on-ramps to care and continuous support that fits in your pocket. It's about using every tool at our disposal to build a safety net so wide and so accessible that no one has to fall through the cracks. But all the funding, all the integrated clinics, and all the apps in the world will have a limited effect if we don't address the final, most fundamental piece: the culture. A system of care is only as effective as the willingness of people to use it. The fear of judgment, of being seen as weak or broken, still keeps millions of people suffering in silence. This is where the work moves from the halls of government and clinics into our homes, our workplaces, and our communities. It looks like workplaces that move beyond wellness programs, with free yoga, and actively build a culture of psychological safety. It means leaders openly talking about their own mental health struggles. It means offering mental health days that are treated with the same legitimacy as sick days. It means providing managers with training to spot the signs of distress in their team members and know how to respond with compassion, not suspicion. It looks like community centers, libraries, and faith-based organizations becoming hubs for mental health literacy, hosting workshops on mental health first aid, where everyday citizens can learn how to help someone through a panic attack or guide them toward professional help. It's about creating neighborhoods where a conversation about anxiety is as normal as a conversation about allergies. This is the blueprint. Policy provides the rights and resources. Integration provides the access. A new workforce provides the human power. Technology provides the scale. And a cultural shift provides the permission for people to finally seek the care they've always deserved. Each piece is essential. Together, they form the bedrock, the framework, and the social mortar of our new continent of care. We have the plans. We have the tools. We know what needs to be done. The only remaining variable is our collective will to build it. But what does that world, the one we build on the other side of this crisis, actually look like? What is the ultimate promise of all this work? It looks like a world where the checkup for your mind is as routine as the checkup for your body. It's a world where a child learns about anxiety and depression in health class, right alongside nutrition and physical fitness. They learn to name their feelings, to understand their brain's weather patterns, and they're given the emotional vocabulary to ask for help long before a storm ever makes landfall. Imagine a workplace where Mental Health Day isn't a whispered excuse or a euphemism for playing hooky. It's a recognized, legitimate reason to recharge, supported by a manager who doesn't ask for a doctor's note, but says, "Take the time you need. We've got your back." It's a corporate culture where vulnerability is seen not as a weakness, but as a cornerstone of a resilient, creative, and human-centered team, where mental health resources are not buried in a subfolder on the HR website, but are actively promoted, easily accessible, and free of charge. Picture a healthcare system where your family doctor asks about your mood with the same gravity they ask about your blood pressure, where seeing a therapist is as unremarkable as seeing a physical therapist for a knee injury. A system where insurance companies don't create labyrinths of paperwork to deny care, but instead streamline access because they finally understand the undeniable truth. Mental health is health. There is no separation. A healthy mind is the foundation for a healthy body and a healthy society. This future world has first responders, police, firefighters, paramedics, who are not only trained to de-escalate mental health crises in the community, but are also given the robust support they themselves need to process the trauma they witness daily. It's a world where our veterans return home not to a broken system and a silent struggle, but to a nation that proactively and comprehensively addresses the invisible wounds of war with the same honor and resources we dedicate to physical injuries. It's a world where social media platforms are designed with psychological well-being as a core metric of success, not just engagement at any cost. Where algorithms are geared towards connection, not comparison, towards inspiration, not inflammation. And it's a world where our communities have spaces, real physical spaces for connection. Parks, community centers, libraries, and public squares that are designed to combat the epidemic of loneliness. Where we don't just live next to each other, but we know each other. Where a simple "how are you?" isn't just a pleasantry but a genuine question, and we have the time and the emotional space to hear the real answer. This isn't a science fiction utopia. This isn't a fantasy. Every single piece of that world is achievable. It's not a matter of invention, but of implementation. It's a matter of priority. It's a matter of choosing to build it together. And that brings us back to this month, to May, to Mental Health Awareness Month. Because this month in its purest form is the blueprint. It's the annual Planning Commission meeting for that better world. It's the one time a year we all agree to put this topic at the forefront of the national conversation, to check our progress, to identify the cracks in the foundation, and to recommit to the work. Awareness is the starting gun. It's the essential, non-negotiable first step. You cannot fix a problem you refuse to see. You cannot heal a wound you deny exists. For decades, the goal was just to get people to acknowledge the reality of mental illness, to whisper its name out loud. We have, in many ways, won that battle. The conversation is happening. It's louder and more honest than ever before. But awareness by itself is passive. It's knowing. The next step, the one we are in right now, is a move from awareness to action, from acceptance to advocacy. And this is where it gets personal. This is where the responsibility shifts from a vague, societal, they to a very specific you. So what does that action look like? It's not one single monumental act. It's 1,000 tiny courageous choices made every single day. Starts with you and the person in your mirror. It means conducting an honest audit of your own mental health. When was the last time you truly checked in with yourself? Not just, how am I getting through the day? But, how am I really? It means giving yourself permission to not be okay. It means treating yourself with the same compassion you would offer a friend who is struggling. It means understanding that self-care isn't selfish. It is the most fundamental act of survival. You cannot pour from an empty cup. Tending to your own garden is the prerequisite for helping anyone else with theirs. Then, you expand your circle. You look to your family, your friends, your colleagues. Action on this level is learning how to have the conversation. It's moving beyond, "I'm fine," you. It's learning to ask twice. The first, "How are you?" gets the automatic response. The second one, the one where you hold eye contact and really mean it, "No, really, how are you doing?" That's the one that opens the door. Action is learning to listen. Not to fix, not to solve, not to offer unsolicited advice, but simply to sit in the discomfort with someone. To be a safe harbor. To let them know they are not a burden, and they are not alone. Your presence can be more powerful than any platitude. And finally, you zoom out to your community, to your city, your state, your country. Action here looks like voting. It means researching candidates and supporting those who don't just pay lip service to mental health, but have concrete plans to fund and expand services. It means advocating for better mental health policies in your workplace or in your child's school district. It means donating your time or your money, if you can, to organizations on the front lines, the crisis centers, the support groups, the research foundations. It means sharing your own story, if you feel safe and able to do so, because stories are the currency of empathy. Stories are what turn statistics into human beings. Every time someone bravely shares their experience, they chip away at the stigma and make it a little bit easier for the next person to ask for help. This is the promise of Mental Health Awareness Month. It's not just about wearing a green ribbon or reposting an infographic. It's a call to arms. It's an invitation to become an architect of that better world. A world where compassion is our default setting, where empathy is our common language, and where no one ever has to suffer in silence. We have stood at the edge of this crisis for too long. We have counted the costs in broken families, in lost potential, in lives ended far too soon. We have seen the problem from every angle. We have measured its depth and its breadth. Now it is time to build. It is time to build a country where the health of our minds is cherished as our most valuable national resource. It is time to build a culture that replaces judgment with curiosity and stigma with support. The work is hard. The progress can feel slow. But it is the most important work we can possibly do. Because everything else, our success, our innovation, our happiness, our very future, rests upon this foundation. The awareness was just the beginning. The real work starts now, and it starts with you.